A quiet September night in 1826 forever changed the history of the small town of Batavia, New York. William Morgan, a 45-year-old stonemason and printer, did not return home. His wife, Lucinda, left with two small children, waited in vain for her husband, unaware that this night would mark the beginning of one of the most notorious scandals in American history. A few days before his disappearance, Morgan openly declared his intention to publish a book revealing the secret rituals of the Masonic Brotherhood. "I will reveal to the world what they so carefully hide," he told friends, disregarding the threats that had begun to come his way. In a town where almost every third respectable citizen was a member of a Masonic lodge, such statements were perceived as a declaration of war. Tensions grew daily. Morgan managed to hand over the manuscript to publisher David Miller, who was not a Freemason himself, and agreed to print the scandalous material. William was last seen being forcibly put into a carriage outside the prison in the neighboring town of Canandaigua. Witnesses heard him shout, "Murder! Save me from murderers!" Then the carriage disappeared into the night, carrying away the man who dared to challenge one of America's most influential secret societies. Who was William Morgan? The man whose name became synonymous with one of the most sensational scandals in 19th century American history. He was presumably born in 1774 in Virginia, although historians have found no precise records of his origin. This gap in his biography subsequently gave rise to many speculations among both his supporters and opponents. It is known that in his youth, Morgan learned the trade of a stonemason and worked in that profession for some time before venturing into publishing. Of medium height with a penetrating gaze and a characteristic beard, thus did his contemporaries describe him. Friends noted his sharp mind and straightforwardness. Enemies, his stubbornness and penchant for adventures. In 1819, Morgan married Lucinda Pendleton, who was significantly younger than him. By the time of her husband's disappearance, they had two small children. Morgan's family life was not easy. Constant financial difficulties forced the family to move frequently in search of a better lot. The question of his membership in a Masonic lodge remains one of the most controversial. Morgan himself claimed to have been initiated in Canada and to have attained the degree of Royal Arch, a high level in the Masonic hierarchy. However, many Masons disputed this, stating that he had only attended a few meetings and picked up fragments of rituals without being formally admitted to the Brotherhood. By 1826, Morgan's life resembled a slow unfolding disaster. His printing press barely stayed afloat, debts grew, and relations with the local community became increasingly strained. Attempts to join the Batavia Masonic Lodge were rejected, possibly due to doubts about his past or personal qualities. It was this humiliation, many believed, that was the last straw, pushing him to decide to expose Masonic secrets. For Morgan, this was not only an act of revenge but also a potential source of income. A manuscript revealing the rituals of the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry could bring significant profit in a society where interest in secret knowledge was unusually high. In the last months before his disappearance, Morgan lived in constant tension. He knew he was playing with fire. "If they find out what I'm doing, my life won't be worth a bent penny," he told publisher David Miller. However, he could no longer stop. Too much was at stake. In the United States of America of the 1820s, Freemasonry experienced a true golden age. After the War of Independence, in which many prominent Masons, including George Washington, played a key role, the Brotherhood became a symbol of the new American identity, free, progressive, and independent of European traditions. Masonic lodges sprang up like mushrooms after rain, penetrating the most remote corners of the young republic. By the 1820s, the country had over 2,000 lodges, with a total membership exceeding 100,000 people. In a small town like Batavia, almost every third respected citizen wore a Masonic apron and knew the secret handshakes of the brotherhood. The structure of American Freemasonry was strictly hierarchical. Novices began with the first degree, entered apprentice, then became fellow crafts, and finally attained the degree of Master Mason. The most devoted members could advance further, obtaining additional degrees in the York or Scottish Rite up to the 33rd degree. Each degree was accompanied by special initiation rituals, including symbolic trials, oaths, and the transmission of secret knowledge. Particularly impressive were the rituals of the Royal Arch, where the candidates symbolically passed through death and resurrection. The oaths taken by Masons were not merely a formality. An initiate into the first degree swore on the Bible, square, and compass that he would sooner have his throat cut than reveal the secrets of the brotherhood. With each new degree, the oaths became increasingly terrifying, stipulating ever more brutal punishments for betrayal. For many, these oaths were merely a beautiful ritual, an ancient tradition without real meaning. But some took them literally, as a sacred obligation, the violation of which truly deserved death. The influence of Freemasonry on American society at that time is difficult to overestimate. Suffice it to say that out of the first 15 U.S. presidents, 9 were Masons. Brothers in aprons held key positions in government, headed courts, commanded the army, controlled banks, and large businesses. In every town, the Masonic Lodge became a center of informal power, a place where deals were struck, destinies decided, and the future of the community determined. Critics even then accused Masons of creating a state within a state, a secret government acting in its own interests. Masons themselves rejected these accusations, emphasizing the charitable nature of their organization and their adherence to high moral ideals. The Brotherhood did indeed actively engage in charity, building schools and hospitals, and helping widows and orphans. But at the same time, Masons also helped each other in obtaining lucrative contracts, appointments to positions, and winning lawsuits. It was this dual nature of Freemasonry, the combination of high ideals with practical mutual assistance bordering on nepotism, that made it so influential and at the same time vulnerable to criticism. In such an atmosphere, William Morgan's threat to reveal the secrets of the order was perceived not just as a breach of oath, but as a blow to the very foundations of the Brotherhood's influence in American society. In the summer of 1826, William Morgan made a decision that would forever change his life and leave a deep mark on American history. Driven to despair by financial difficulties and stung by the Batavia Masonic Lodge's refusal to admit him, he decided on an unprecedented step: to reveal the Brotherhood's secret rituals in a printed book. Illustrations of Masonry. That was the title of the manuscript Morgan worked on in strictest secrecy for several months. For this purpose, he teamed up with local publisher David Miller, who himself had reasons to dislike Masons and enthusiastically embraced the idea of publication. Morgan's manuscript was not a figment of his imagination. It described in detail the rituals of the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry, from the initiation of an entered apprentice to the raising to the degree of Master Mason. Morgan meticulously laid out the secret passwords, handshakes, symbolic gestures, and sacred words exchanged by members of the Brotherhood. He paid particular attention to the oaths taken by Masons, promising to keep the order's secrets under pain of a cruel death. "I agree to have my throat cut, my tongue torn from its root, and to be buried in the sands of the sea." With such words, according to Morgan, every novice entering the brotherhood swore. News of the impending publication spread through Batavia with lightning speed. It's hard to say who first informed the Masons of the betrayal, but the Brotherhood's reaction was immediate and resolute. Initially, they tried to act within the law. Several respected lodge members visited Morgan, reminding him of his oath and the possible consequences of violating it. When this did not help, the Masons approached the printer Miller, offering a significant sum to abandon the publication. Upon being refused, they tried to buy the manuscript, but without success. Then the Masonic Brotherhood resorted to more aggressive tactics. Articles defaming Morgan's reputation appeared in the local newspaper, calling him a drunkard, a fraud, and a liar. Anonymous threatening letters regularly arrived at his home. One night, unknown individuals attempted to set fire to Miller's printing house, but the fire was extinguished. Tension in Batavia grew daily. The town was virtually divided into two camps. On one side, Masons and their supporters, who constituted the majority of the local elite. On the other, non-Masons, many of whom had long been suspicious of the secret society and its influence. Lucinda Morgan begged her husband to abandon the publication, fearing for his life and the family's well-being. But William was unyielding. He told friends, perhaps he was driven not only by a desire to restore justice, but also by the hope of the book's financial success. In a society where interest in secret knowledge was immense, such a publication could bring significant profit. In early September 1826, the first pages of the manuscript were typeset and ready for printing. Miller announced the upcoming publication of the book, offering to take pre-orders. It was too late to back down. The Masons realized that ordinary methods of pressure were not working, and, apparently, made a fateful decision. On September 11th, William Morgan was arrested on charges of theft and sent to Canandaigua prison. The final act of the drama, which would soon shake all of America, had begun. The Masons' plan to eliminate William Morgan began to take concrete shape in early September 1826. The Brotherhood could not permit the publication of a book revealing their secrets, and after the failure of legal pressure, they resorted to more decisive actions. A key role in the conspiracy was played by Nicholas Chesebro, master of the Canandaigua Lodge and sheriff of Ontario County. It was he who devised a cunning plan that was meant to appear legal, yet permanently dispose of the unwelcome exposer. The first step was to find a legal pretext for Morgan's arrest. Such a pretext soon emerged. A certain Ebenezer Kingsley, a Mason from Canandaigua, claimed that Morgan owed him a small sum of money and had stolen a shirt and tie. The accusation was clearly fabricated, but it proved sufficient for Judge Gene Chipman, also a member of the Brotherhood, to issue an arrest warrant. On September 12th, Constable Holloway Hayward, acting under Chesebro's instructions, arrived in Batavia and arrested Morgan right in front of his frightened wife. Lucinda pleaded not to take her husband, but the law, it seemed, was on the side of the authorities. Morgan was placed in a wagon and, under escort, sent to Canandaigua, 50 miles from Batavia. In the Canandaigua court, the case quickly fell apart. The judge, having reviewed the theft charge, found it unfounded and acquitted Morgan of criminal liability. However, a new reason for detention immediately arose: a civil lawsuit for non-payment of a debt of $2.69 to the same Kingsley. Since Morgan could not immediately pay this amount, he was sent to the local prison until the debt was settled. Morgan spent one day in prison. On the evening of September 13th, a carriage pulled up to the prison building. The jailer, Timothy Fitch, subsequently claimed that a man, introducing himself as Morgan's friend, posted bail for him and asked for the prisoner's release. Upon leaving the prison, Morgan was immediately seized by a group of people waiting outside. Despite his desperate resistance and cries for help, he was forcibly put into the carriage, which immediately set off. The conspiracy proved to be remarkably well organized. Along the entire route from Canandaigua to Fort Niagara, located on the border with Canada, a chain of reliable Masons was established, ensuring changes of horses and the preservation of secrecy. The carriage traveled mainly at night, stopping at predetermined locations where local brethren provided necessary support. A particularly disturbing aspect of the entire operation was that it involved not just ordinary Masons, but people holding official positions: the sheriff, judges, constables. The justice system, designed to protect citizens, had been transformed into an instrument of revenge for a secret society. This clearly demonstrated how deeply Masonic ties had penetrated the state structures of America at that time. On the evening of September 13, 1826, William Morgan's fate was sealed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a closed carriage pulled up to Canandaigua prison. The jailer, Timothy Fitch, later recounted that a well-dressed gentleman, identifying himself as a friend of Morgan's, had appeared before him. The stranger paid the required sum of $2.69 and demanded the immediate release of the prisoner. When Morgan stepped outside the prison gates, it was not a friend who awaited him, but a group of masked men. They fell upon him, gagged him with a handkerchief, and forcibly dragged him into the waiting carriage. Witnesses to this scene later recalled Morgan's desperate cries. But no one intervened. The carriage set off, carrying its captive into the unknown. The abductor's route was meticulously planned. The carriage traveled along Ridge Road, an old road running parallel to Lake Ontario. At each station where a change of horses was required, Masonic brethren were already waiting, ensuring a swift replacement of the team and absolute silence. In the town of Rochester, new conspirators joined the procession, and in Lewiston, the carriage was met by Eli Bruce himself, a high-ranking Mason and the superintendent of Fort Niagara. The last leg of Morgan's journey took place deep in the night. Exhausted, gagged, he likely already understood that there would be no salvation. Fort Niagara, located right on the border with Canada, at the point where the Niagara River flows into Lake Ontario, became the final destination of this ominous journey. By that time, the fort had been abandoned by the army and was used only as a warehouse. Its massive stone walls and remoteness from populated areas made it an ideal location for secret affairs. Morgan was taken to the Powder Magazine, a small, windowless stone structure with a single heavy door. There, he was shackled and left under the guard of several trusted Masons. According to testimonies that investigators managed to piece together much later, Morgan spent several days in captivity. He was regularly visited by high-ranking members of the order who offered a deal: freedom and a significant sum of money in exchange for abandoning the publication of his book and relocating to Canada. But even in this hopeless situation, Morgan remained unyielding. What happened next is still a matter of dispute. According to the most common version, an improvised Quote 1 took place on the night of September 20th. Morgan was found guilty of betraying the Brotherhood and sentenced to death. Several men took Morgan out into the middle of the Niagara River in a boat. There, in the dark waters on the border of two countries, the life of a man who dared to challenge a powerful secret society came to an end. According to one version, heavy stones were tied to his feet and he was thrown into the water. According to another, he was strangled and his body was then drowned. William Morgan's body was never found. The turbulent waters of the Niagara carried him away, along with the direct evidence of the crime. However, secrets rarely remain secret forever. Within a few days, rumors spread throughout the county about Morgan's disappearance and the Masons' involvement. These rumors, gradually accumulating details and confirmations, turned into a loud scandal that soon engulfed the entire country. The first attempts to investigate William Morgan's disappearance began almost immediately, but ran into an invisible wall of silence. Lucinda Morgan, left with 2 small children and no means of support, was the first to raise the alarm. She approached the local sheriff, but he, being a Freemason, treated her statement with marked indifference. Quote, he said, without even taking down her testimony. When the woman insisted on an investigation, the sheriff reluctantly questioned several witnesses, but they all seemed to have conspired. No one saw anything, heard anything, knew anything. Jailer Fitch claimed that Morgan voluntarily left with an unknown person who had paid his debt. The innkeeper in Rochester swore that no carriage with a prisoner had passed through his establishment. The superintendent of Fort Niagara denied ever seeing Morgan. The conspiracy of silence was comprehensive and impenetrable. Only thanks to the persistence of several citizens not associated with Freemasonry was the case not immediately closed. Publisher David Miller, risking his own safety, began publishing articles about Morgan's disappearance in his newspaper, urging witnesses to come forward. Timothy Strong, a lawyer from a neighboring county, undertook to represent Lucinda's interests. Gradually, public pressure mounted, and the New York State authorities were forced to appoint a special investigator. This was Daniel Mosley, an experienced lawyer with an impeccable reputation. However, even he faced unprecedented obstacles. Key witnesses suddenly changed their testimonies or disappeared altogether on the eve of important hearings. Documents mysteriously vanished from court archives. Juries, among whom Freemasons invariably appeared, refused to issue guilty verdicts even in the presence of direct evidence. When investigators tried to question the Freemasons who attended lodge meetings the day before the abduction, they unanimously refused to answer, citing, quote, 1. Local judges, many of whom wore Masonic aprons themselves, recognized such refusal as legal. Masonic solidarity proved stronger than civic duty. The case of Eli Bruce, the superintendent of Fort Niagara, was particularly telling. Several witnesses claimed to have seen him receive a carriage with a prisoner on the night of September 14th. However, during questioning, Bruce denied his involvement, and when the investigator pointed out inconsistencies in his testimony, he simply smiled and said, quote, 2. The judge, also a Freemason, did not see this as perjury. Masonic influence was felt at all levels of the investigation. Newspapers controlled by the Brotherhood called the entire story, quote, 3. Quote, 4. When New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, himself a high-ranking Freemason, offered a reward for information about Morgan's fate, many perceived it as an empty gesture designed to appease the public. None of the initiates dared to break the oath of silence, even for a significant reward. The confrontation between the investigation and the Masonic Brotherhood reached its climax when one of the witnesses, not a Freemason, stated directly in court, "In this city, the law is powerless against men in aprons." His words proved prophetic. As the investigation into William Morgan's disappearance progressed, a sinister pattern began to emerge around the case. One by one, key witnesses mysteriously disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The first in this grim succession was James Lacey, a Rochester innkeeper. It was he who informed investigators that he had seen Morgan in a carriage guarded by several men. The day before his official testimony in court, Lacey went fishing and never returned. His boat was found capsized on Lake Ontario, but his body was never recovered. The official version stated, "An accident." However, many noted the strange coincidence. Lacey was an experienced boater and knew the lake perfectly. The second to disappear was Samuel Barton, a stableman from a post station in Lewiston. He claimed to have personally changed horses for the carriage with the prisoner and could identify some of the escorts. The day before giving testimony, Barton received a letter offering a high-paying job in Canada. He left and was never seen again. A month later, a short letter arrived for his family. Quote, 0. The handwriting, according to his wife, was not his. Especially alarming was the story of Thomas Colton, assistant superintendent of Fort Niagara. While intoxicated, he blurted out in a tavern that he had seen Morgan held in the powder magazine. The next day, Colton was found dead in his own bed. The coroner determined the cause of death to be, quote, 1, although Colton was only 32 years old. No autopsy was performed, and the body was hastily buried. Even those who managed to testify were not safe. Joshua Folger, who testified about strange activity at Fort Niagara on the night of the alleged murder, survived 2 assassination attempts. The first time, an unknown assailant shot at him from the bushes but missed. The second time, they tried to poison him by mixing something into his food. Folger survived but fled the state in fear, refusing to participate further in the investigation. Particularly telling was the fate of Edward Giddings, a low-ranking Mason who decided to break his oath and tell what happened in the lodge the day before the abduction. The day before his scheduled meeting with the investigator, his house was set on fire. Giddings miraculously escaped but lost all his property. Soon after, he died of, quote, 2, as stated by the doctor who treated him. This same doctor was the master of the local Masonic lodge. Investigators tried to check all these cases for a possible connection to Morgan's case, but each time they encountered the same conspiracy of silence. Witnesses refused to speak, evidence disappeared, and investigations reached dead ends. Especially disturbing was that in each case, the official authorities, sheriffs, judges, coroners, quickly closed the cases, finding natural causes of death or disappearance. As one journalist of the time noted, "The hand of the brotherhood reaches even into the grave, silencing those who might speak." The public was horrified. If a powerful secret organization could eliminate undesirables with impunity, then no one could feel safe. Newspapers not controlled by Masons published lists of disappeared witnesses under headlines such as "The Long Arm of Retribution" and "Death Follows Truth's Heels." Some publications even began a special section, "Victims of the Morgan Case," regularly updating the list of those who suffered for trying to shed light on this crime. Masons, in turn, denied any involvement in these deaths and disappearances, calling them coincidences or the result of mass hysteria. "People always die," wrote the pro-Masonic newspaper Rochester Daily Advertiser, "but only now is every case linked to our brotherhood." However, the number of coincidences was becoming too great to ignore. For many years, the truth about William Morgan's fate remained hidden behind a veil of Masonic silence. However, time has a way of weakening even the strongest oaths. Decades after the tragic events of 1826, confessions from participants in that sinister conspiracy began to emerge, shedding light on the final hours of the man who dared to challenge the powerful brotherhood. The first to break the vow of silence was John Whitney, one of the alleged kidnappers. On his deathbed in 1839, he confessed to a priest that he was among those who took Morgan by boat to the middle of the Niagara River. Whitney whispered, "According to him, the original plan did not involve murder. Morgan was to be secretly transported to Canada and left there with enough money to start a new life away from America. However, something went wrong. A few more years later, in 1841, Orsamus Turner, a Buffalo publisher and high-ranking Mason, made a confession. In a personal letter which was to be published only after his death, he described a gathering of high-ranking members of the Brotherhood where Morgan's fate was decided. "We voted on what to do with the traitor," Turner wrote. "The majority favored expulsion, but there were also those who demanded the ultimate penalty provided by our oath." However, the most detailed and shocking confession was made by Henry Valance in 1848. On his deathbed, at his home in Cleveland, Ohio, he summoned a doctor and a notary to witness his final confession. Valance claimed to be one of 3 men directly involved in Morgan's execution. He dictated to the notary in a weakening voice. According to Valance, Morgan listened to the verdict silently, then asked for a few minutes to pray. His blindfold was removed, and he gazed at the starry sky for a long time, whispering something. Then, heavy stones, wrapped in canvas, were tied to his feet. Valance died the day after his confession. The notary who witnessed his words was himself a Mason and hesitated for a long time before making the document public. The text of the confession was published only in 1850 in a small anti-Masonic newspaper and initially did not attract widespread attention. It is important to note that many historians view these deathbed confessions with caution. Some consider them genuine, while others point to possible exaggerations or distortions, especially given that they appeared at the height of the anti-Masonic movement, when such, quote, "six" could yield political dividends. Valance's confession remains particularly controversial. The details of his story too closely match the popular version of events circulated by the anti-Masonic press. Furthermore, some of the facts he mentioned contradict circumstances established during the investigation. For example, he claimed that the murder occurred on the same night Morgan was brought to the fort, whereas other testimonies indicate that the captive spent several days there. The Morgan affair, which began as a local incident in a small town, soon grew into a powerful social movement that changed America's political landscape. By 1827, outrage over the Masons' actions and their influence on the justice system had swept across New York State and began to spread to neighboring regions. People gathered at mass rallies demanding a fair investigation and punishment for those guilty of Morgan's abduction and alleged murder. Anti-Masonic sentiment quickly evolved from a moral stance into a political force. Citizens united into vigilance committees, published exposés on Freemasonry, and called for a boycott of businesses owned by members of the fraternity. Local elections suddenly became a referendum on the Masonic question. Candidates were forced to publicly declare their stance on the secret society. By 1828, the movement had formalized into a full-fledged political party, the first third party in U.S. history. The Anti-Masonic Party was founded in the town of Leroy, near Batavia, where Morgan disappeared. Its fundamental principle was opposition to any secret societies as incompatible with Republican values. Read the party manifesto. The first leader of the party was Thurlow Weed, a talented journalist and political strategist from Rochester. It was he who transformed local outrage into an organized political force capable of challenging traditional parties. Under his leadership, the anti-Masons began to publish newspapers, hold conventions, and nominate candidates for local and federal elections. The ideology of the new party went far beyond simple criticism of Freemasonry. The anti-Masons positioned themselves as defenders of ordinary Americans against a privileged elite. They advocated for expanded suffrage, democratization of the political process, and limiting the influence of secret clubs and societies on government affairs. The movement rapidly gained strength. By 1830, the anti-Masonic Party controlled the legislatures of several states and had representatives in the U.S. Congress. In Vermont, the anti-Masonic candidate William Palmer was even elected governor. The party's success forced many Masons to publicly renounce their membership in the fraternity. Hundreds of lodges across the country were forced to close due to a mass exodus of members and public pressure. In 1831, the first national convention of the anti-Masonic Party was held in Baltimore, the first party convention in American history with delegates from all states. It adopted an official platform and nominated a presidential candidate, William Wirt, a former U.S. Attorney General. Although Wirt did not win the 1832 election, the party received significant support in the northern states and solidified its status as a serious political force. The anti-Masonic movement had a profound impact on American political culture. It introduced new methods of political mobilization, mass rallies, party newspapers, organized fundraising. Many of these innovations were later adopted by major parties. No less important was the ideological legacy of the movement. The anti-Masons were the first to formulate populist rhetoric of opposition to elites, which would become a permanent element of American politics. Their demand for transparency in government affairs and criticism of secret influences laid the groundwork for future reform movements. By the mid-1830s, the anti-Masonic Party began to lose influence, gradually dissolving into the new Whig Party. However, its legacy continued to live on in American political culture, and the case of William Morgan remained a symbol of the struggle for transparency of power and equality before the law. The Morgan affair dealt a blow to the Masonic movement in America, from which it could not recover for decades. The wave of public indignation that rose after William Morgan's disappearance turned into a veritable tsunami, sweeping away Masonic lodges across the country. What began as a local scandal in a small town in New York State escalated into a national crisis for the entire fraternity. By 1830, Freemasonry in America was on the verge of extinction. The statistics spoke for themselves. If before the Morgan affair there were more than 2,000 active lodges in the United States with a total membership of about 100,000 people, by the mid-30s their number had decreased to several hundred. In New York State, the epicenter of the scandal, the number of Masons decreased from 20,000 to less than 3,000. The mass exodus from the fraternity took on the character of a veritable flight. People who had been proud of their affiliation with the ancient order for decades now publicly burned their Masonic aprons and regalia. Newspapers of the time regularly published lists of Masons with their public renunciations of the fraternity. Read a typical advertisement of the time, the blow to the higher degrees of Freemasonry was particularly strong. While ordinary, which practiced the first 3 degrees of initiation, could sometimes continue secret meetings, more elite organizations like the Knights Templar or the Scottish Rite virtually ceased to exist. Chapters of the Royal Arch, the very degree whose rituals Morgan intended to reveal, closed one after another. Physically, Masonic temples, these majestic buildings with columns and mysterious symbols, became empty and fell into disrepair. In small towns where the fraternity could no longer maintain its premises, lodges sold their property and officially disbanded. In large centers, Masons were forced to hold meetings secretly, often changing meeting places to avoid public condemnation. The economic consequences for the fraternity were no less devastating. Many Masons lost their businesses due to boycotts of their enterprises. Masonic lawyers lost clients. Masonic doctors lost patients. Masonic politicians lost voters. The public stigma associated with belonging to the fraternity became so strong that some Masons were forced to move to other states or even leave the country. Survival required transformation. Those lodges that managed to survive the crisis radically changed their approach. Freemasonry began a slow and painful process of reform. The first step was a review of the oaths. The most brutal formulations about punishments for betrayal were softened or completely excluded from the rituals. Threats of, quote, 3, quote, and, quote, 4, quote, gave way to more symbolic expressions. The second important change was greater openness. If Masons previously categorically denied the very existence of their rituals, they now began to publish official materials explaining the philosophy and goals of the fraternity. Masonic magazines, accessible to the general public, appeared, explaining the principles of the organization and refuting the most fantastic accusations. Freemasonry also shifted the focus of its activities from secret rituals to public charity. Lodges that survived the crisis actively participated in social projects, building schools, hospitals, helping the needy. This was a conscious step designed to restore the fraternity's reputation as a force for good in society. Gradually, by the mid-19th century, the intensity of anti-Masonic sentiment began to subside. New generations of Americans who did not experience the Morgan affair regarded Freemasonry with less hostility. The Civil War, with its own tragedies, pushed old grievances into the background. The fraternity slowly regained its position, though it never regained the influence it had before 1826. However, the legacy of the Morgan affair forever changed the character of American Freemasonry. From an elite secret society with political influence, it transformed into a more open organization focused on the moral improvement of its members and charitable activities. Modern American Freemasonry, with its transparency and public orientation, is largely a product of the transformation the fraternity was forced to undergo after William Morgan's disappearance. The trials of William Morgan's alleged abductors began in the spring of 1827 and dragged on for 4 long years. In total, over 20 court proceedings were held, but their results were striking in their disproportion to the gravity of the crime. Of the 60 suspects, only 10 faced trial, and only 4 received punishment, and even that was surprisingly lenient. The first accused was Nicholas Cheesebro, sheriff of Ontario County and master of the Canandaigua Masonic Lodge. It was he who organized Morgan's arrest on fabricated charges of theft and coordinated his transport to Fort Niagara. Despite numerous testimonies of his central role in the conspiracy, the court found him guilty only of unlawful imprisonment, a misdemeanor, not a felony. The verdict? A year in prison, a ridiculous punishment for orchestrating an abduction that led to an alleged murder. Other defendants received even lighter sentences. Lawton Lawson, directly involved in the abduction, was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. Eli Bruce and John Whitney, who delivered Morgan to Fort Niagara, received 3 months in prison each. The remaining conspirators were fully acquitted or avoided trial. The reasons for such an outcome were obvious. Masonic influence permeated the entire judicial system. In most processes, the judges were Masons, the lawyers were Masons, and many of the jurors were Masons. In one of the trials, the sheriff responsible for forming the jury personally selected 9 Masons out of 12 jurors. When this was revealed, the judge, also a Mason, saw no violation of procedure. The most egregious case was the trial of Ezra Darrow, accused of perjury. Darrow, a high-ranking Mason, lied under oath, claiming he knew nothing of the plans to abduct Morgan. When witnesses emerged ready to refute his testimony, they mysteriously disappeared on the eve of the hearing. Darrow was acquitted, and the judge, in his closing remarks, effectively accused the prosecutors of persecuting a worthy citizen. New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, himself a high-ranking Mason, under public pressure, appointed 3 special prosecutors to investigate the case. However, 2 of them soon resigned, citing, quote, "zero" in their work. The third, John Spencer, continued the investigation but complained that, quote, "1." Particularly indicative was the fate of the key prosecution witness, Edward Giddings. After he agreed to testify against his Masonic brethren, his house burned down under suspicious circumstances, and he himself was found dead a few days before the trial. The official cause of death, quote, "2," raised doubts even among the most skeptical observers. Paradoxically, the trials, intended to restore justice, only intensified public outrage. People saw with their own eyes how the justice system was distorted to suit a secret brotherhood. Every acquittal, every lenient sentence became new proof that Masons were above the law. The most striking aspect of all the trials was that no one was accused of Morgan's murder. Despite numerous testimonies of his violent death, the case was officially treated only as an abduction. Prosecutors explained this by the absence of a body. Without it, bringing a murder charge was legally difficult. Critics, however, argued that the real reason was the authorities' unwillingness to bring the investigation to its logical conclusion. The last trial in the Morgan case took place in 1831, 5 years after the disappearance. By that time, most of the evidence had been lost, many witnesses had died or disappeared, and public interest had shifted from punishing specific culprits to fighting Freemasonry as an institution. The Morgan case remained legally unsolved, becoming a symbol of how a secret society can manipulate the justice system. The disappearance of William Morgan left a deep imprint not only on America's political and social life, but also on its cultural heritage. The mysterious fate of the stonemason, who dared to challenge a powerful fraternity, has been an inexhaustible source of inspiration for writers, artists, and filmmakers for nearly 2 centuries. The first literary responses appeared almost immediately after the tragic events. In 1827, the novel The Secret Pact, written by James Fenimore Cooper, was published. Although the author denied a direct connection to the Morgan affair, the parallels were obvious. The main character encountered a secret society controlling local power. The book was a huge success, becoming one of the first American bestsellers. In subsequent decades, the theme of Masonic conspiracy firmly entered American literature. Edgar Allan Poe, himself supposedly a Mason, included elements of Masonic symbolism and hints at secret societies in many of his works. His famous short story, The Cask of Amontillado, is interpreted by many literary scholars as an allegory of Masonic revenge against a traitor, inspired by Morgan's story. By the end of the 19th century, the Morgan affair had turned into a kind of American legend, acquiring ever new details in the popular consciousness. Mark Twain, with his constant interest in American folklore, repeatedly mentioned this story in his works and public appearances. In The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there is a scene where the characters discuss the man the Masons drowned for revealing their secrets, a transparent reference to Morgan's fate. Visual art also reflected this dramatic story. In the 1830s, Engravings depicting Morgan's abduction and his alleged execution became widespread. Particularly popular was the work of artist David Claypool Johnston, Morgan's Last Moments, which depicted a bound captive in a boat, surrounded by sinister figures in Masonic regalia. With the advent of cinema, Morgan's story migrated to the screen. In 1915, the silent film The Traitor, based on these events, was released. During the McCarthy era, when fear of secret conspiracies again gripped America, Hollywood released several films where the Masonic theme was intertwined with contemporary political anxieties. The Morgan affair had an indelible impact on popular culture, becoming the prototype for countless stories about sinister secret societies. From Dan Brown's novels to the TV series The X-Files, echoes of this story can be found everywhere. The image of the omnipotent secret brotherhood, capable of making a person disappear and manipulating the justice system, has firmly entered the American collective consciousness. This story also spawned an entire tradition of American conspiracism. The Morgan affair was the first instance where broad masses of Americans believed in the existence of a powerful conspiracy ruling the country from the shadows. This line of thinking continues today in theories about a world government, the Illuminati, and other secret forces. It is particularly interesting that the image of Freemasonry in American culture remains deeply contradictory. On the one hand, Masons are depicted as a sinister force. On the other, as guardians of ancient wisdom and defenders of democratic values. In the film National Treasure, the protagonist uncovers a secret hidden by the Founding Fathers, many of whom were Masons. This duality reflects the real ambivalence of American society towards Freemasonry. Over the nearly 200 years since William Morgan's disappearance, historians' views on the event have undergone significant evolution. Modern historiography offers a more nuanced understanding of a case that once divided American society. While in the 19th century, sharply polarized interpretations predominated. Masons denied any involvement in the crime, and their opponents painted a picture of a sinister conspiracy. Today, researchers strive for a more balanced analysis. In the 2000s, historian William Preston published the seminal work The Morgan Affair, a Reappraisal, which for the first time utilized newly discovered archival materials. Among these were the personal diaries of several Masons involved in the abduction and previously classified minutes of the Grand Lodge of New York's meetings from that period. These documents confirmed the Masonic fraternity's involvement in the abduction, but cast doubt on the version of intentional murder. According to the new data, the initial plan indeed only envisioned Morgan's expulsion to Canada with a significant payment for his silence. However, something went wrong, possibly due to Morgan's own resistance or the excessive zeal of the perpetrators. Another important direction in modern research has been the study of the case's social context. Historian Sarah Kennedy, in her work, quote, showed that the conflict surrounding Freemasonry reflected deeper contradictions in American society during the Jacksonian era, between nascent democracy and traditions of elite governance, between egalitarian aspirations and the desire for social hierarchy. The anti-Masonic movement, in her opinion, was not merely a reaction to a specific crime, but an expression of a broader popular distrust of closed elites of any kind. Archaeological research has also contributed to understanding the case. In 2009, a New York Historical Society expedition conducted underwater operations at the supposed site of Morgan's murder, at the confluence of the Niagara River with Lake Ontario. Although remains were never found, which is unsurprising after so many years, fragments of clothing and personal items from that period were discovered, which theoretically could have belonged to Morgan. However, precise identification proved impossible. Modern historians continue to debate many aspects of the case. Was Morgan truly a Mason, or did he merely pose as an initiate? Was his murder sanctioned by high-ranking members of the fraternity, or was it an initiative of local lodges? How reliable are the later confessions of the participants? These questions remain open, making Morgan's story not only a tragedy of the past, but also a living research problem. One of the most interesting modern interpretations belongs to historian Robert Watson, who views the Morgan affair as the first instance of moral panic in American history, a phenomenon where a real incident triggers a disproportionately strong public reaction that extends far beyond the immediate event. According to Watson, the anti-Masonic hysteria became a prototype for future waves of public fears, from the Red Scare to modern conspiracy theories. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since William Morgan vanished into the September night, yet his story continues to resonate in American society. Today, as we look back on these events, we see in them something more than just a criminal drama. It was a test of young American democracy, a moment of truth for a nation defining its values. In the town of Batavia, New York, stands a modest monument, an obelisk 38 feet high, erected in 1882. Carved upon it are the words, "To the sacred memory of William Morgan, a citizen of New York, kidnapped and murdered in 1826 for intending to reveal the secrets of Freemasonry." Every September, historians and the merely curious gather here to honor the memory of a man whose fate changed the course of American history. Modern Freemasonry in America bears little resemblance to the influential and secretive organization that existed before the Morgan affair. Today, it is primarily a charitable fraternity whose members openly wear their badges and emblems. Masonic temples hold open houses, publish their rituals, and actively participate in public life. The transformation, which began after the crisis of the 1820s, turned a once secret society into a transparent organization integrated into civil society. However, the legacy of the Morgan affair extends far beyond the reform of a single fraternity. It laid down a fundamental principle of American political culture: distrust of closed elites, and the demand for transparency from all institutions of power. The anti-Masonic movement, which emerged as a reaction to the disappearance of one man, became the prototype for all future populist movements in American history, from the progressives of the early 20th century to contemporary activists demanding government accountability. The questions raised by the Morgan affair remain relevant today. Where does the line lie between the right to private association and the necessity of public oversight? How can we ensure that no group of citizens stands above the law? How can traditions and innovations be balanced in a developing democratic society? For historians, the Morgan affair represents a rare opportunity to observe a moment when society confronts a fundamental contradiction and is forced to reevaluate its values. In the post-Revolutionary War era, Americans were still defining what it meant to be a republic. Morgan's disappearance forced them to consider whether secret societies were compatible with democratic principles, whether equality before the law could exist when some citizens were bound by oaths placing brotherhood above the state. Modern researchers also see deeper symbolism in this story. Morgan, a simple stonemason who challenged a powerful fraternity, embodied the archetypal American ideal, a lone voice of truth against the system. His tragic fate reminds us of the fragility of civil liberties and the price that sometimes must be paid for their protection. Today, as we face new challenges, From corporate influence on politics to government surveillance of citizens, William Morgan's story reminds us of the importance of vigilance. It teaches us that democracy is not a static state, but a continuous process requiring the active participation of citizens in defending their rights and freedoms. Perhaps the most important lesson of this story is that no society is immune to abuses of power. Even in a young republic founded on the ideals of freedom and equality, secret influence could distort the workings of justice. And only through the courage of individual citizens willing to challenge the system were these distortions exposed and corrected. The memory of William Morgan is not merely a tribute to one man. It is a reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the true strength of democracy lies in the willingness of its citizens to uphold the principles of justice, even when it requires personal courage and self-sacrifice.